Somebody asked a question about custom farming. Okay, so with custom farming, you're doing all the risk. As a landowner, you're taking all the risk, production risk. You're going to hire somebody to farm it for you. You're paying all your input costs, all the seed, all the fertilizer, all the chemicals. You're going to pay your taxes, of course, always. And then, but you get all the crop. You get 100% of the crop. Okay? So in some cases, especially when crop prices are high, it can be a great deal. In other cases, if you have a bust for a crop income or crop, then cash rent's a better deal because you still get your cash rent no matter what happens to the crop. Okay, follow where I'm going with that? I do know of a farm management company that likes to write either a crop share lease or a custom farming lease, or they manage custom farming. Some people like to do that. Look at their numbers and see if that makes sense for you. I'm not against anything. I'm just saying that's just an option. What other questions were there about that? I guess there's a part about September 1st, not very long. Okay, I'm also going to talk about provisions for a lease that I think you should consider no matter what. I'm sticking away from the speaker is good. And no matter what kind of lease you have, crop share, cash lease, or flexible cash lease, here's some good provisions to consider and use and think about, okay? I'm worried about fertility. I think that especially if you have a high-priced cash lease, $275 or higher, three and a quarter, 3.5. If your tenant is paying that kind of cash lease, don't expect them to be putting a lot of fertilizer out there because it's going to cost too much. It'll put them under from a budget standpoint. So Jim and I were at a conference. Jim and I were doing one of these meetings out of Kearney. We talked to soil scientists out there at Kearney, but ran into him by accident. I said, "Will people be mining the soil to make their ends meet this year?" He said, "Absolutely." And then what he worried about and what I worry about is using phosphorus up. In other words, not putting phosphorus out there and having them take the crop off, which uses more phosphorus, either soybeans or corn, either one, and then end up phosphorus deficient when they leave the lease. So make sure that the landlord is covered on phosphorus provisions in the lease, meaning that you need to have a minimum amount of phosphorus left out there. Does that make any sense at all? Are you with me? Okay. So how much phosphorus should be, check. I wish Aaron was here. He'd be our agronomist for this region. But it's going to be around 20 parts per million is what you want left. 20 to 25 is kind of a minimum. And by the way, that's something, if you're doing that to a tenant, then I think that's something the landlord should pay for. That soil test as they leave the lease to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of phosphorus left out there. But make sure that you have that written in your lease that there has to be a minimum amount of phosphorus there, right? Don't just leave them hanging on that. Now, the other thing that goes right along with that is I think you have to protect the tenant too. And here's what I mean by that. The tenant in some cases will put out $180 to $100 to $120 worth of fertilizer, phosphorus especially, out per year. They'll put out more than that because they got to cover the nitrogen. Nitrogen kind of has to be covered every year for corn, not with beans, but for corn it does. But phosphorus, they'll put out a whole load of phosphorus, more than what they need. In other words, most tenants, when they put out phosphorus, will put out enough for 2 or 3 years. If you kick them off after they've made a $100 per acre investment in phosphorus, what else should be in that lease? Protection for them so they could get reimbursed for some of their phosphorus if they leave it for the next tenant. Follow where I'm going with that? Does that make sense? So you have to cover both parties with that. Just be really careful. Just be careful about that. All right, now, what else do I have on this slide? Lime, in my book, like I said before, most of my talks don't come from a research study or from a textbook. Most of my talks come from 40-some years of doing this work. Okay? It's what I hear from Nebraskans like yourself. That's what I hear this from. So that's where my talk comes from. Lime, in my view, has always standardly been a landowner expense. Done. End of story. We don't have to talk about that anymore, right? The reason I say that is if you put the appropriate amount of lime on, and it's good ag lime, it's going to last 10 to 15 years here in eastern Nebraska. So that's a land investment. It's not something the tenant puts on that occurs in 1 year. It's an investment that the landowner puts on for a multiple number of years. You follow me on this? So land should be covered by the landowner. In some cases, the tenant, I think, felt sorry for the landowner because he knew he was paying too low of a cash rent, and so he put the lime out there. The tenant did it. And I think if something like that happens, I understand that. That does happen in certain cases. And like I said, there's no rules on this. There's no laws that say this has the way it has to be. So the point is, if the tenant's putting a big charge of lime out there, 2 or 3 tons an acre, and it's going to last 10 or 15 years, 15, 20 years in some cases, then I think that it's appropriate to also write in the lease that if the tenant's doing that, should be a landowner expense, but it's not. And the landowner has the obligation to reimburse that tenant. You know, if they expect it to last 10 years and they're off of it after 5, maybe they get half their lime cost back or something like that. You could set that up however you want to, okay? Any questions or any comments about that? All right. All right, so some erosion typically happens when we have these great big rainfall events. I get that. But if there's excessive erosion, that great big ditches and gullies, and it's happened on my farm too. I should go find that picture I took with my camera and go throw that in my slide deck so you see that hole. But if that's a landowner expense, and I did pay to have it fixed. Excessive erosion is a landowner expense. In some cases, like we talked about earlier, the tenant does have excavators and dozers and patrols and stuff like that to fix that sort of thing. Then the landowner should be given a bill, and they should pay for that, the tenant to do that work or hire that work done. However, if you got something like this happening with that erosion there in that field, I think it's really important to look at that field carefully and figure out where that water's coming from. In other words, if I'm going above where that erosion started and I can figure out where that water's coming from, that's where we put the terrace in to keep that water from getting down there and causing that to happen. That's an important thing. And what we do in eastern Nebraska now, it's been very successful over the last 20 years or so, is not put in just terraces, but put in parallel terraces with tile drains on them. And that way the water's held behind that parallel terrace, and it all kind of funnel, or it's graded so it goes to this one drain, a tile, and the tile takes it out into a waterway or into the local ditch or whatever, a road ditch or wherever it has to go. That's been extraordinarily successful. It's a little more expensive than just putting in a terrace, but it lasts a lot longer, and it's a way better fix, in my view, because you're letting the water go away more slowly than just blowing out the end of a terrace down to a waterway that ends up with ditches like that. All right, now, non-crop acres. Who's controlling trees and noxious weeds? Jim says it's the other party, right? That's what he told you before lunch. And here's my view on that. Noxious weeds should be controlled by the tenant and pastures especially. That's a tenant expense. Thistles, that sort of thing. Trees, even though I consider cedar trees to be obnoxious, they're not on the noxious weed list. Oddly enough, I was at State Fair just yesterday. And if you go to the big exhibit hall, there's people there from the Nebraska weed people, University of Nebraska, it's Nebraska Natural Resources, the weed program. Can't remember the name right now. And on the north wall there, and north entry, and they have the noxious weed brochures and stuff like that there. I go up to them and I go, you know, cedar trees is the most obnoxious weed we have in eastern Nebraska. Why aren't they on that list of those noxious weeds? And the officer that was there said, because they're native to Nebraska. They're a native tree. So we can't put them on the noxious weed list. That's all introduced weeds that came in. Although they are obnoxious and they take out pastures, we have to be really careful with cedar trees. But here's your key height for a cedar tree. Right there, 3 foot. 3 foot or lower, it's extraordinarily easy to take care of cedar trees. You can burn them, you can spray them, you can chop them off, you can put 2 goats per acre out on them. It all works. It all works. You get higher than 3 foot, and then the expenses go up. I know that one farmer that had cedar trees that got 10, 12, 14 foot high, and he had locust trees out there, the ones with great big thorns on them. And he hired somebody to come in and remove them mechanically, and it cost him over $100 an acre. if you're spending that kind of money to renovate a pasture or to get that kind of crap out of a pasture, the bottom line is you will never return enough money to pay for that $100 an acre. You're losing there. That's a loss. Don't do that. Control it when it's like this. Now, if you can find that rare day in the spring where there's not much wind and you've got some other growth there to run a fire, the fire is clearly a superior way to handle cedar trees, but like this last spring, I'm not sure we had a day to go have a fire anywhere. And not any day that I could go out and throw a match. I know that. Okay. So cedar trees should be handled, and the landowner is primarily responsible. If you talk to the tenant into doing that, that's fine. But then also be willing to reimburse the tenant for that extra by discounting their pasture rent or doing something. Tillage versus no-till, organic versus non-organic. I think really be careful, because as landowners we think, ooh, I like this no-till idea. We're not out there losing soil because we're keeping it all in place and improving our soil structure, and we get more organic material in the ground, and it just really works better for infiltration of water and all that sort of thing. That's right. And if that same landowner says, I like this organic thing because then I'm not spraying crap out here and I'm not spraying my herbicides and insecticides, I can't just handle it that way, and you want to ask for that too, that's when you get in trouble. Because if I've got weed control to deal with on my farm, how am I controlling weeds with no-till? I'm spraying them with herbicide, right? No-till. I don't till. If I want to have organic production, what do I have for weed control? Weed control means that I don't spray anything, herbicides, all right? As a matter of fact, even to qualify for organic, I think you got to be no sprays for 3 years. I think it's like 3 years, no spray to get to organic. I'm not critical of anything. Just don't ask. Okay, so how am I controlling weeds in organic production? Usually with steel, with a cultivator. All right, follow me? So I can't. That wouldn't be no-till, would it? You know what I'm trying to say? So you have to be careful. Don't ask for organic and no-till, because that's asking a lot, because you're conflicting systems there. Someday we might be able to manage that, but today not very many people can. That's my point. All right. If I was a pasture, Jim already talked about who's taking care of the fencing. He gave us kind of a talk about fencing, so I'll let that go. The big thing I think has to be discussed with pasture is the big three. What happens with fire, drought, and hail? What about those disasters? Right now we have a drought going on, and Jim already alluded to the fact that we probably should be changing pasture rents a little bit to account for the fact that we have to either... My brother had one pasture southeast of Milford that got hit with two of these calamities in the same year. Sometime in May, he got that great big hailstorm that came through that area. And so that knocked down all the grass in his pasture, and now he's faced with this epic drought. I mean, kind of a flash drought, to be honest with you. And so he's had to haul hay to his cattle for over a month now already on that pasture. He's kept them there because it's better than having them in a yard at home. They're better out on the pasture there. But he's had to haul hay for over a month already. And hay prices kind of keep going up. Okay, we're up over $120 to $130 a bale, not a per ton, a bale for alfalfa hay. We're up over $100 a ton for CRP, or around $100 a ton for CRP, $110 a ton, something like that. So it's not cheap to have livestock right now because the hay prices keep jumping. All right. So here's my point. Fire, drought, hail, that happens. It's happening. So what are you going to do with the pasture rent? Have that discussion before that problem occurs, so you know how you're going to manage it. Don't discuss it after it's all said and done, because then somebody's going to be disappointed. Do that before the time. Hunting rights. Crop ground versus pasture. Okay, if you have a typical eastern Nebraska cash lease on farm ground, right, with me? Farm ground, cash lease, eastern Nebraska, the hunting rights go to the tenant unless they're held out of the lease by the landlord. Unless the landlord doesn't want the tenant to have the hunting rights. On crop share, you share the crop, so you share the hunting rights. Are you with me? Okay. On pastures, if you have a typical 5-month pasture lease that Jim talked about this morning, then that usually goes from May 1st to October 1st or June 1st to November 1st or something like that, those 5 months. Then because hunting season doesn't start until after November 1st, right? The pasture rights stay with the landowner. Or the hunting rights stay with the landowner. My mistake. Hunting rights stay with the landowner. Are you with me? Does that make sense? Pastures. Okay, now. All right. You're a hunter. And you want to come hunt deer on my place. Okay? And I'd be happy to have you hunt some deer because there's too many. They just knock down the beans. They lay in the beans. They're eating corn. I mean, it's just a mess. I tell you what, you go hunt on my place for free. I don't care. Kill as many as you can legally. Okay? So just do it right. I'm fine with that. Now, he goes hunts on my place, and I didn't know it, but there's a hole out there. He falls in the hole and he busts up his leg. Can he sue me? Yeah, you can sue anybody. Anytime, for any reason. But, if I didn't charge him to hunt, if I was a good guy, and said, just go hunt, and I'm a good guy and go do that, the Nebraska Recreational Use Law says that if I'm hunting, fishing, horseback riding, ATV riding, whatever you can think of as a recreational activity on my place, if you get hurt, it's on you. Not on me as a landowner. Because I was a good guy, I let you go hunt my pasture. However, if I wasn't such a good guy and I said, hey, throw me $100 a buck if you get one. Or, I charge you something for it. Now if he falls in the hole and gets hurt, guess what? He'd come back and get me for liable. Okay? I don't have that to stand back on. Either way, you still need to have good liability insurance on your farm. I hope you do. Mine cost me about $150, $170, something like that per year. I have it tied onto my home insurance, and that's what you absolutely have to have. If you are charging for hunting, then make sure you tell your insurance person because you're going to get a little bit of a different policy. It's going to cost more. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay. Corn stalks. Again, just like on hunting, if it's farm ground and it's corn stalks and it's cash rent, my tenant gets them. The tenant gets them unless I hold them out. That belongs to the tenant. If it's crop share, then we each have a share of the crop, discuss how you're going to share the crop. Where I get questions on corn stalks is two ways. Number one, they'll go, well, I'm a landowner and my tenant has a cash rent and now I see he doesn't have any cattle, he's rented the stalks out to a neighbor and he took money for those stalks. The neighbor is paying him for use of the stalks. Shouldn't I get some of the money as the landowner? I'm paying taxes on that ground. Guess what? Under cash rent, you don't. They rented the ground. They can do with it what they want. If they want to rent it out for corn stalks, that's their deal. Okay? On crop share, then you should share that rent. What should rent be if you were going to rent out corn stalks? To me, it depends on who's doing the work. If the tenant is putting out all the fence and they're hauling in all the water and they have to go check those cattle every day, if they're doing all the work, I don't know that I worry about having them pay a dang thing. Use the corn stalks. I'm happy. Why? Because they're cleaning up the corn, so I don't have to worry about controlling corn in the soybean field next year. It's a good thing. And they're leaving manure. It's all good. Now, if I'm on my home place where I grew up and I have the water in the yard and I'm pumping the water for those cattle and I have that old fence around my cornfield and I got it up hog tight and ready to go, 4-wire or whatever, it's my fence, I take care of it, I keep it strung, and I'm watching those cattle for the guy, so only has to come by once a week to see what's going on, then yeah, it's appropriate to get paid. Depends on who's doing that work. Follow me on that? Okay, now, what I don't care for on corn is, listen, I know we put up a lot of corn stalk bales and we should. Corn stalk bales are a nice roughage source especially for gluten feed and some silage and stuff like that to help give the bellies some room and some scratch on cattle, and they're a good thing. They're a good thing, and they're good bedding. But just don't let your cornfield be made into round bales every year. It's too hard on the organic matter and it's too hard on the phosphorus. Every 4, 6, 8 years, if that's when they make corn stalks off of it, fine. Just don't let the corn stalks come off as bales every year. especially if they're really aggressive in taking that material off. It's just too hard on those nutrients. Okay? Manure application. Yes, it's a good thing. If it smells, it only smell for a day. Live with it. Okay? Just deal with it. Manure is really good because it adds phosphorus to the soil, it adds organic matter to the soil, and most Nebraska land can use a lot of organic matter. But make sure that you limit the amount of phosphorus or amount of manure that you put out there on a per year basis to what that ground needs from an agronomic standpoint. My famous story is this. Remember a minute ago I said that 20, 25 parts per million, 30 parts per million is about right for phosphorus levels in the soil to make a good crop? Remember I said that? So this one farmer in my county in Iowa, while I was over there for 13 years, he would scoop out his farrowing shed twice a year, once in spring, once in the fall. He'd load all that manure up, and where do you go if you're sweaty and hot and you want to get rid of manure? To the field right outside the farrowing shed, the first field you come to. So he kept manure in that same field twice a year, all those years, and what was his phosphorus level in that field when they did a soil test? 400 parts per million. Okay? Now, does that hinder corn production? No, it doesn't. But here's the problem with putting out that much phosphorus in that field that doesn't ever get used. The trouble with phosphorus is it's, okay, nitrogen, if you have too much nitrogen in it, goes down and ends up in the groundwater, right? The high nitrate, we've heard of high nitrate stuff, especially around Duncan and Columbus and some of those places. Along the Platte and along the loop, between the Platte and the loop going west, that's a problem. Out there by Fullerton, there's high nitrates. I wouldn't want to raise a baby there right now. You'd have to bring in all bottled water for your baby. Now, phosphorus doesn't go down. It stays up on top. So when you have those catastrophic rain events, what happens to the phosphorus? It all heads down to where we're at. We're not very far from the Platte, ends up in the Missouri, ends up in the Gulf. And that's why we're getting yelled at in agriculture, because we put too much phosphorus and other nutrients down in the Gulf, including silt. So let's be careful with the application of phosphorus from manure loads and keep it under control. All right, the tenant should communicate things to the landowner, things like how much rain did it come, and what's my weed pressure, what insecticide, and what's happening. Right now, Labor Day weekend is a perfect time for a tenant. Do I have any tenants in the room? How many farmers do I have here? Brian? That's it, huh? Okay. Now's a perfect time to make sure your landowners are out standing in the field. It's my joke, outstanding in the field. Because it's a perfect time to go see how the year went. Is that corn all brown? Does it even have ears on the stalks? You know, if it's dry land, you saw a lot of brown corn here, right, when you drove in today? Does it have ears on the stalks? How big are the ears? What happened? What happened with, my ears? I got a picture on my phone I could show you. My ears are small because they're all tipped back at the top because they just didn't fill, because they didn't have enough water to fill. The kernels, I broke one ear in half. The corn kernels are real shallow. They're going to be really light. I'll be lucky if I don't get docked for a test weight at the elevator when I haul that corn in. It's just going to be a rough go. It's going to rub. It just didn't rain. So this is a good time to go check that out so you're not surprised when you get those harvest reports. Go see it. Go see if there's weeds out there. Go see if there's excessive erosion somewhere. Go check that out. Tenants should make sure the farmers or the landowners get there. Landowners should try and get there themselves. This weekend's a great weekend to go. And if not, tenants should get them there. Okay? To report all this stuff, seeing what's going on. Decide kind of to start that discussion about what should happen for next year. The landowners should have a different objective. Landowners need to go observe that stuff and have those conversations with the tenants. But I think the landowner really needs to be sure that they communicate with the tenant. What they want is a long-range vision for the ground. My concern is this. I think too many landowners go into a tenant-landowner relationship thinking, how much cash rent can I get? Let's see, I think it's going to go higher this year. Let's see if we can stick it to them a little harder because I need more money. All right? And guess what? In some cases, there's a nursing home bill or something like that where it's really serious to try and get more money. I get that. I'm not trying to be critical of landowners. But I would submit this. We only get the ground, I'm a landowner, I told you that. We only get the ground for a little while. 40, 50 years out of tens of thousands of years that ground has been there. And what's our job? Our job is not to see how much money we can make on a per acre basis. Our job ought to be, how do we leave that ground a better place, in a better situation, in better health for the next generation, because I bet we still need it for crop production for feeding people of the world, because the number of people keeps kind of going up all the time. We should leave that place in a better place. That should be our number one job. And we should have that communication with the tenant about what should happen to make that place a better place. What do we need to do? My brother continually comes to me and says, hey, if you want to spend some money, we should do this. Well, I don't want to spend some money, but I do understand that we should probably do this. And so eventually I'll get, okay, I got some money, let's get $3,000 or $4,000 worth done right now, and then I'll do another $3,000 or $4,000 next year or something like that. Do you follow where I'm going with that? I don't let him do it all at once because that's too expensive for me. But he can do a little bit, all right? I'm lucky I can pull that off economically. But the point is, always be thinking about what you can do to make that better farm for the next generation. And then I already talked about managing the farmstead when I told my story about the husband and wife that took care of their parents. All right. If you have a cash lease, not necessarily a crop share, but a cash lease, if the tenant is maintaining the terraces and waterways and never sending you a bill, if they're controlling noxious weeds, if they're maintaining the fences on pasture, maintaining the irrigation system, the tenant on cash rents should get rent should be adjusted. Don't worry about getting top cash rent if that tenant's doing good things for your place and keeping things up and all that sort of thing. We spend too much time saying, well, that's not equitable, that's not fair, he's not paying what we should be paying. Listen, if it's your son or uncle or nephew or whatever, and they're doing good work for the farm and making it a better place, do you really have to have top rent? I hardly think so. We have to treat them in a way that they will want to continue to be productive on that farm and do the right thing for you as a landowner. Okay, written leases and release provisions. Okay, if you have a verbal lease, handshake agreement or verbal lease, you needed to end that yesterday. Today's too late. All right, I'm sorry. All right? Unless you, I mean, of course, when two parties agree, then it doesn't matter what day it is. Two parties agree, just go on. But I suggest, Jim and I both are very strong on the idea that we should have written leases, no verbal or handshake agreements. And to terminate a verbal or handshake agreement, they're having a session 1 week too late. You need to notify the other party, in this case mostly tenants, that you're notifying the tenants that verbal or handshake agreement needs to end, and we're going to get to a written lease. The cool phone call I had last week, maybe on Monday, I don't know, it was early this week or late last week, was from a lady that owned ground, and she said, I have a verbal or handshake agreement. I just simply want to change it to a written lease. I want to keep the same guy. I want to keep my same tenant. He's doing a great job. So how do I do that? Still, you write them a letter, get it done. You have to have that be done in their hands before September 1st. Why is it September 1st? Because all leases in Nebraska that are handshake or verbal agreement, by order of the Supreme Court defined this, they start on March 1st and you go to February 28th. So the next lease in Nebraska will start March 1st to 23 and go to February 29th to 24 because that'll be a leap year. And that's the year for a verbal or handshake agreement. If you have a written lease, you skip all this. A written lease will start whenever you want it to start, whatever your tenant agree to. The written lease will have a notification of when it's going to stop, but that's what you guys agree to too, also. Know that on a written lease, that you should still have a termination date and a notice to quit date, the notice of when we're not going to keep you as a tenant for next year. That also needs to be there too. And I would still make it sometime in the fall. Why? Because farmers always get discounts, cash discounts, to buy their inputs in the fall. Seed, fertilizer, fuel, all that stuff. And so we better let them know they're going to farm our place next year, even if we have a written lease. You still should let them know before they start buying inputs to cover your place too. Just the right thing to do. The lease termination is not the same for a pasture lease. Remember what I said about the normal pasture lease in Nebraska goes from May 1st to November 1st or some combination thereof, 5 months in that period. The pasture lease ends every year, so no notification of terminations due. The tenant should be going back and asking the landlord, hey, can I have the lease for another year? Because it ended, right? The only reason it wouldn't end is if you have a written lease that says it's a multi-year written lease for 5 months a year, then you would need to cease that. But on a verbal agreement, there's no termination necessary. So, for leases now, written leases, number one. Number two, you got to get a start and end date up there. Number three, you need to have timing of lease termination. I already talked about that in sometime in the fall. Are we going to put in a holdover clause, meaning are we going to let the lease continue on for the next year? That's fine, but make sure that you define the last part when you can renegotiate that lease. Because let's be honest about it, when prices are going up, who wants to wait till towards March 1st to renegotiate? The landlord. When prices are going up, who wants to negotiate right away before September 1st? The tenant. Prices are going down, who wants to negotiate right away? The landlord. Who wants to wait until right before March 1st? The tenant. So if you would define when you're going to renegotiate that lease, I don't care what the date is, just figure it out and do it about the same every year so you're not playing that game with each other. Don't play the game. Make sure that date is defined. And holdover just says we're willing to have an extended year lease, but we're still going to set up a time each year to renegotiate that cash rental arrangement. Follow what I'm saying there? You still set a time where you could readjust the cash rent for that, even though it's a cash rent. You don't, in other words, what I'm trying to encourage you to do is not sign a 5-year cash lease for X number of dollars and then have the cash rental rates in Jim's survey go up, and not be able to capture any of that. What I'm trying to say, or it's a cash rental rates go down, and sticking that to your tenant. That's not fair to them either. So you have to, I think you assign a time, and even though the cash lease is going to continue on for several years, just say when you're going to negotiate again and how that negotiation is going to be set up. Okay, if you need to get to a written lease and you want to check out what a good written lease looks like, consider using the website aglease101.org. Check under the document library and you come up with this part right here. And over here on the right side is fillable cash lease forms. They're PDF files. You can actually type your material right into a computer and print it all out. And those lease forms are pretty complete. You may not even fill in all the blanks, but that's a nice website to use to get to starting your lease. Okay? One other thing quick. Right now, before in this section, we're going to take a quick break. I started something called LandLink a year and a half ago now almost. And what I was trying to do is I was trying to take young people that didn't have access to land and match them to people that had land but didn't have a successor coming back, the landowners that didn't have a successor. So we started a database where people could make an entry, an online application, and we're trying to match land seekers with landowners. And we use applications and we review those. We do phone interviews with people to make sure their application's accurate. And you can apply for it right there at the cap.unl.edu landlink. And you can ask questions, just contact me. I'm really interested in getting more landowners into landlink because right now I have about 150 or so land seekers. I still have only about 10 landowners. Okay, so if you have an operation that you would like to see someone continue as your operation, instead of letting it be gobbled up by the neighbors, considering putting it into the landlink, and we'll try and get a younger person or a younger family involved with that. All right?